Abraham Lincoln Lincoln February 12, 1809 April 15, 1865 was an American lawyer and statesman who served as the 16th President of the United States from 1861 until his assassination in 1865. Lincoln led the nation through the American Civil War and succeeded in preserving the Union, abolishing slavery, bolstering the federal government, and modernizing the U.S. economy. Lincoln was born into poverty in a log cabin in Kentucky and was raised on the frontier, primarily in Indiana. He was self-educated and became a lawyer, Whig Party leader, Illinois state legislator, and U.S. congressman from Illinois. In 1849, he returned to his law practice but became vexed by the opening of additional lands to slavery as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. He re-entered politics in 1854, becoming a leader in the new Republican Party, and he reached a national audience in the 1858 Senate campaign debates against Stephen Douglas. Lincoln ran for president in 1860, sweeping the North to gain victory. Pro-slavery elements in the South viewed his election as a threat to slavery, and Southern states began seceding from the Union. During this time the newly formed Confederate States of America began seizing federal military bases in the South. Just over 1 month after Lincoln assumed the presidency, the Confederate States attacked Fort Sumter, 1A, U.S. fort in South Carolina. Following the bombardment, Lincoln mobilized forces to suppress the rebellion and restore the Union. Lincoln, a moderate Republican, had to navigate the contentious array of factions with friends and opponents from both the Democratic and Republican parties. His allies, the War Democrats and the Radical Republicans, demanded harsh treatment of the Southern Confederates. Anti-war Democrats called Copperheads despised Lincoln, and irreconcilable pro-Confederate elements plotted his assassination. He managed the factions by exploiting their mutual enmity, carefully distributing political patronage, and by appealing to the American people. His Gettysburg Address came to be seen as one of the greatest and most influential statements of American national purpose. Lincoln closely supervised the strategy and tactics in the war effort, including the selection of generals, and implemented a naval blockade of the South Strait. He suspended habeas corpus in Maryland, and he averted British intervention by defusing the Trent Affair. In 1863 he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared the slaves in the states in rebellion to be free. It also directed the Army and Navy to recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons and to receive them into the armed service of the United States. Lincoln also pressured border states to outlaw slavery, and he promoted the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which upon its ratification abolished slavery. Lincoln managed his own successful re-election campaign. He sought to heal the war-torn nation through reconciliation. On April 14, 1865, just days after the war's end at Appomattox, he was attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., with his wife Mary when he was fatally shot by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Abraham Lincoln is remembered as a martyr and a national hero for his wartime leadership and for his efforts to preserve the Union and abolish slavery. Lincoln is often ranked in both popular and scholarly polls as the greatest president in American history. Polls as Republican Politics 1854-1860 Emergence as Republican leader. The debate over the status of slavery in the territories failed to alleviate tensions between the slaveholding South and the free North, with the failure of the Compromise of 1850, a legislative package designed to address the issue. 101 In his 1852 eulogy for Clay, Lincoln highlighted the latter's support for gradual emancipation and opposition to both extremes on the slavery issue. 102 As the slavery debate in the Nebraska and Kansas territories became particularly acrimonious, Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas proposed popular sovereignty as a compromise. The measure would allow the electorate of each territory to decide the status of slavery. The legislation alarmed many Northerners, who sought to prevent the spread of slavery that could result, but Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act narrowly passed Congress in May 1854. 103 Lincoln did not comment on the act until months later in his Peoria speech of October 1854. Lincoln then declared his opposition to slavery, which he repeated en route to the presidency. 104 He said the Kansas Act had a declared indifference, but as I must think, a covert real zeal for the spread of slavery. I cannot but hate it. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world. 105 Lincoln's attacks on the Kansas-Nebraska Act marked his return to political life. 106 Nationally, the Whigs were irreparably split by the Kansas-Nebraska Act and other efforts to compromise on the slavery issue. Reflecting on the demise of his party, Lincoln wrote in 1855, "I think I am a Whig, but others say there are no Whigs, and that I am an abolitionist. I do no more than oppose the extension of slavery." 107 The new Republican Party was formed as a Northern party dedicated to anti-slavery, drawing from the anti-slavery wing of the Whig Party and combining Free Soil, Liberty, and anti-slavery Democratic Party members. 108 Lincoln resisted early Republican entreaties, fearing that the new party would become a platform for extreme abolitionists. 109 Lincoln held out hope for rejuvenating the Whigs, though he lamented his party's growing closeness with the nativist Know-Nothing movement. 110 In 1854, Lincoln was elected to the Illinois legislature but declined to take his seat. The year's election showed the strong opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and in the aftermath, Lincoln sought election to the United States Senate. 106 At that time, senators were elected by the state legislature. 111 After leading in the first 6 rounds of voting, he was unable to obtain a majority. Lincoln instructed his backers to vote for Lyman Trumbull. Trumbull was an anti-slavery Democrat, and had received few votes in the earlier ballots. His supporters, also anti-slavery Democrats, had vowed not to support any Whig. Lincoln's decision to withdraw enabled his Whig supporters and Trumbull's anti-slavery Democrats to combine and defeat the mainstream Democratic candidate, Joe Laldridge Madison. 112 Civil War Main Articles, American Civil War and Battle of Fort Sumter. Major Robert Anderson, commander of the Union's Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, sent a request for provisions to Washington, and Lincoln's order to meet that request was seen by the secessionists as an act of war. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Union troops at Fort Sumter and began the fight. Historian Allen Nevines argued that the newly inaugurated Lincoln made 3 miscalculations: underestimating the gravity of the crisis, exaggerating the strength of Unionist sentiment in the South, and overlooking Southern Unionist opposition to an invasion. 180 William Tecumseh Sherman talked to Lincoln during Inauguration Week and was sadly disappointed at his failure to realize that the country was sleeping on a volcano and that the South was preparing for war. 181 Donald concludes that his repeated efforts to avoid collision in the months between inauguration and the firing on Fort Sumter showed he adhered to his vow not to be the first to shed fraternal blood. But he also vowed not to surrender the forts. The only resolution of these contradictory positions was for the Confederates to fire the first shot. They did just that. 182 On April 15, Lincoln called on the states to send a total of 75,000 volunteer troops to recapture forts, protect Washington, and preserve the Union, which, in his view, remained intact despite the seceding states. This call forced states to choose sides. Virginia seceded and was rewarded with the designation of Richmond as the Confederate capital, despite its exposure to Union lines. North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas followed over the following 2 months. Secession sentiment was strong in Missouri and Maryland, but did not prevail. Kentucky remained neutral. 183 The Fort Sumter attack rallied Americans north of the Mason-Dixon line to defend the nation. As states sent Union regiments south, on April 19, Baltimore mobs in control of the rail links attacked Union troops who were changing trains. Local leaders groups later burned critical rail bridges to the Capitol, and the Army responded by arresting local Maryland officials. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus where needed for the security of troops trying to reach Washington. 184 John Merryman, one Maryland official hindering the U.S. troop movements, petitioned Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney to issue a writ of habeas corpus. In June, in ex parte Merryman, Taney, not ruling on behalf of the Supreme Court. 185 issued the writ, believing that Article I, Section 9 of the Constitution authorized only Congress and not the President to suspend it. But Lincoln persisted with the policy of suspension in select areas. 186-187 Lincoln with officers after the Battle of Antietam. Notable figures from left are 1. Colonel Delos Second 4. General George W. Moore L. 5. Alexander S. Webb, Chief of Staff, V. Corps 6. McClellan. 8. Dr. Jonathan Letterman 10. Lincoln 11. Henry J. Hunt 12. Fitz-John Porter 15. Andrew A. Humphreys 16. Captain George Armstrong Custer.